All our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is 12:27. We will finish at 1:27. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians already pay the highest power rates of any province in Canada. Today we learned that Nova Scotia Power is looking to increase each of the upcoming 2 years, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are already struggling under the high cost of power, and Mr. Speaker, they can't afford to pay any more. In 2008, the NDP appeared before the UARB to ask that Nova Scotia Power's rate request be denied. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier: will the NDP do the same thing now that they're in government?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government will be there, of course, to protect the interests of ratepayers, to make sure that the requests are appropriate. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't stop there. What we did is something that the Leader of the Opposition campaigned against and voted against, which is we removed the tax off of electricity.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia ratepayers will find cold comfort in the words of the Premier, sitting and watching as Nova Scotia Power continues to dig into the pockets of every single Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's bad enough. It's bad enough when the utility does that, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the Premier talks about taking off tax off of electricity bills. At the same time, he added, Mr. Speaker, a fee to every single ratepayer's bill in the province of Nova Scotia. The tax he talks about, Mr. Speaker, took $30 million off of those bills. The fee that he added has increased those bills by over $40 million, Mr. Speaker. By anyone's math, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, that means that government and that Premier is taking $10 million out of the pockets of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier support the position that he held in May of 2009 and force Nova Scotia Power shareholders to pay his NDP electricity tax instead of
the Honourable the Premier?
Mr. Speaker, we took the tax off of home energy, something that member voted against and campaigned against, Mr. Speaker. But worse than that, he now wants to do away with the conservation charges, Mr. Speaker, which saved $100 million in electricity charges that came off of the bills of ordinary Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, every member of this House believes in the efficiency charges. Mr. Speaker, the difference between this party and that government is who pays. They believe every Nova Scotia ratepayer should pay. We believe, Mr. Speaker, the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power should pay, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while he stands on the sides of the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power, we'll stand with Nova Scotia ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after 10 years of Conservative and NDP governments are paying the highest rates in any province, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals asked for the executive bonuses to be permanently paid for by shareholders, not ratepayers, Mr. Speaker, and the NDP government refused. We've asked for a performance audit every 2 years, Mr. Speaker, of Nova Scotia Power, and the NDP government refused. We want to force Nova Scotia Power to hold public meetings with each and every rate request, Mr. Speaker, and the NDP government refused. Mr. Speaker, we ask that the regulatory costs be paid for by the shareholders and not the ratepayers, Mr. Speaker, and the NDP government has refused, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier: why are we are trying to force tougher regulations and more competition on Nova Scotia Power. Why are you standing in the way?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if anyone is standing with the ratepayers, it is the members of this government here. We're the ones who took the HST off of home energy, Mr. Speaker. We're the ones that made sure that conservation plans were in place that allowed ratepayers to save money, Mr. Speaker. And the Leader of the Opposition knows full well that the Utility and Review Board hearings are open. Members of the public are able to attend. In fact, if they want to intervene, they can make an application to do that, Mr. Speaker. He's the one, although he doesn't say this, he knows that the executive bonuses, in fact, are paid by the shareholders, not by the ratepayers. He knows that happened last time. He knows it happened in this rate application, Mr. Speaker. He knows that, but he chooses to mislead Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, Nova Scotia Power applied for yet another 3% increase in our power rates in 2013 and another 3% again the year after that. Two increases that will cost Nova Scotia families an average of $100 more on their power bill by the end of next year. The compounding effect of all these power rate increases is causing real hardship for Nova Scotia families and Nova Scotia businesses. And Mr. Speaker, ironically, this is coming at a time when the disposable income of Nova Scotians is actually dropped by 1.8%. In light of all this evidence, my question to the Premier is, will he now admit that his own bite-the-bullet electricity plan is broken, it is not working, and go back to the drawing board to come up with a plan that puts affordability of Nova Scotia families first when setting power rates?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the situation that Nova Scotia ratepayers find themselves in today is a product of the decisions that were made in the past. The past dictates the future, Mr. Speaker. The problem is that we had a progressive Conservative government, and before that a Liberal government, that chained the electricity grid in this province to fossil fuel markets internationally. That means that when coal goes up 75%, the cost of electricity goes up as well, Mr. Speaker. We are getting off of fossil fuels. We have an electricity plan that means that Nova Scotians will have long-term stable rates, that businesses will have a competitive economic advantage over other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. That is the Nova Scotia electricity plan. That one is working. Theirs didn't.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Here's two things I know about the past, Mr. Speaker. One is we did not have the highest power prices in the country in the past, but we do now under this Premier. And the other is that in the past, when he was the opposition leader, he went around and told Nova Scotians he could drop power prices by 15% and got 32,000 of them to sign a petition to that effect. That's what he said in the past. Now he defends the skyrocketing price of power when he's actually in a position to do something about it, and I will table the actions of the Premier when he was in opposition. That is the record of the past. The record of today is that we have the highest power prices in all of Canada under that Premier. The fact, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, why has he broken his commitment that he made in the past, before the last election, to the people of Nova Scotia to make power affordable, and in fact done the opposite and made it the most unaffordable in all of Canada?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, quite the opposite. We took the HST off of home energy, something that member voted against. If we were standing here today, the price of electricity would be another 8% higher if they had their way, Mr. Speaker. That is a fact. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have today an electricity generation system that was based on decisions to build coal-fired plants over many years made by the Conservative and Liberal governments. They decided that they were going to privatize the system, put profit and competition into the system. Those were the decisions they made. We, unfortunately, have to live with those decisions, and we are we are putting in place legislation which will take us off of fossil fuels, that will put in place renewables. The provinces with the lowest power rates in the country, why are they there, Mr. Speaker? Because they have renewables.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that the Premier has to live with is his own words, which he spoke in opposition when he told Nova Scotians that he would do something about the price of power. The only thing that the Premier has to live with today is the fact that under his watch we have the highest power prices in all of Canada. That is what the Premier has to live with, and nothing else. Except one more thing, Mr. Speaker, that the actual effect of high power prices, as hard as it is on families, is also costing Nova Scotians their jobs, because one of the drivers behind this most recent increase is the fact that we don't have a new page, we don't have a Bowater with the same number of jobs, because of the high price of power under his watch. Now, how ironic that today Nova Scotia Power says they have to raise the price of power to solve the problem that the high cost of power in the last 2 years caused in the first place. So if we're truly interested in creating new jobs and opportunity in this province, will the Premier at least admit the obvious today, that high taxes and high power rates are killing jobs in Nova Scotia, and his economic development policy is behind it all, and it's failing Nova Scotians, and he needs to rewrite it before it's too late?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we are very much on track with the electricity plan. I would point out to the member opposite one of the reasons why this particular increase is being driven higher is because the capital contribution by those mills did not take place, Mr. Speaker. That was a problem with the structure of the industrial grid. But, Mr. Speaker, the member of the Conservative Party just tabled this, and he obviously didn't read it, because what I actually said is this: two things have to happen. First, Nova Scotia Power must move quickly to use more renewables like energy, like wind and tidal power. Secondly, help consumers with the one thing they can't control, which is the amount of power they use, which is exactly what this government is doing, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Nova Scotians heard yet another patient from the forensic centre, Mr. Speaker, who did not return. To date, we are not sure where this patient is, whether she is a threat to the public or, equally problematic, Mr. Speaker, a threat to herself. Last week, I asked the Premier to have an outside expert review what happened in the Denny case, Mr. Speaker, and we learned here in question period that is underway. My question to the Premier: can the Premier tell Nova Scotians who will be reviewing the process and procedures at the East Coast Forensic Hospital, especially with references to protocols around unescorted passes?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll refer that to the Minister of Health for an answer.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the honourable member for the question. Obviously, we are all very concerned when a patient from our forensic hospital is away without permission from that hospital on a leave. And the procedures indeed are being reviewed. They will be reviewed by external psychiatrists and what have you with experience and expertise in forensic medicine, and the Deputy of Health and Wellness, as well as the Deputy of Justice, has been in conversations with the physician, Dr. Goldblum, who is a psychiatrist who leads now the Mental Health Commission of Canada, with respect to recommendations he might make on who would be appropriate to lead those reviews.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when the Departments of Health and Justice were reviewing themselves, it was going to take 30 days in this House, Mr. Speaker. Today is day 20. Now that we have reached out for an external support, external person outside of our province to review the protocols and procedures that are in place around the forensic hospital, my question to the Premier: how much longer will Nova Scotians have to wait to get some answers around that review?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I'll forward that on to the Minister.
The Honourable
of
Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated, we have already in the process begun to identify people who have expertise in this field who can do an independent review from outside the province of Nova Scotia. I believe some names have been forthcoming, and that process is well underway. And as the Minister of Justice and I and the Premier committed in this House, we will have some preliminary report within 30 days of our announcement. So in about 2 weeks' time or slightly less, we will be able to provide more information to the member.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, for just some clarification for the House, last week in this House it was stated that they've already stepped outside of our province and looked for support and looked for someone to lead an external investigation. I want clarification from government whether they've actually already got someone to look from an external point of view, or are the Deputy Ministers of Health and Justice just looking for some suggestions outside of our province, and are they still going to lead that, or are we seriously going to ask someone from outside to do an independent review so that Nova Scotians can have confidence in what is found?
Honourable the Premier.
Again, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank God the Premier stayed for question period with the answers we're getting from him today. Mr. Speaker, we learned this morning that a patient from the East Coast Forensic Hospital was released on unescorted pass Friday morning and has yet to return. This is at least the second time in the past 2 weeks that a person who has been remanded to the hospital after being found not criminally responsible for an offence has gone missing for an extended period of time. Mr. Speaker, this is now day 4 and we don't know the whereabouts of this individual, nor do we have a good idea as to whether she is a danger to the public or to herself. My question to the Minister of Justice: in the 2 weeks which have elapsed since the Denny incident and this most recent one, what specific measures has the Minister taken to ensure the safety of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. The safety of all Nova Scotians is a paramount concern to me personally, and that this government takes that seriously. We have continued to ensure that our policies are monitored and reviewed, and I'm very confident in the staff and the quality of the staff and the people we have here. Unlike the member from the opposition and the opposition party, they don't really are concerned at all about the employees there and the quality of work they do, but I want to acknowledge in this House and this floor that I have the greatest confidence in that staff and that there are good policies in place, but we're dealing with human elements, and that the issues around mental health are not black and white, and they are people that have needs that need to be addressed.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
No, Mr. Speaker, once again, rather than being proactive, this minister is more than happy to sit back, allow incidents to happen, and then try to offer us these weak excuses as to why they're taking place. Mr. Speaker, after the Denny incident, the minister had the opportunity to immediately put in protocols to ensure the safety of both the patients, the staff, and all Nova Scotians. Today, what we're hearing is more excuses and being told, wait until the review has been undertaken. While that has been taking place, we now know that another individual has not returned from one of these passes. So the minister clearly had the option to take immediate action, to put in some protocols to try to ensure the safety of both the patients and Nova Scotians in light of the Denny incident. My question to him is very simple. Why, once again, have you failed to take proactive action and ensure the safety of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm responsible for the criminal justice system. The health care and the patients that are in our hospitals comes under the area of the Minister of Health. And what I will do is turn this question over to her.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who are at East Coast Forensic Hospital are patients. They've been convicted of no criminal offence. They have been reviewed by a review board, the Criminal Review Board, in terms of what risk they pose to the community. And based on that, they are kept in the facility and gradually reintroduced into the community through a treatment plan that is developed by the nurses and doctors who work in that facility. Part of the treatment plan includes leaves into the community, Mr. Speaker, and we have protocols in place if someone goes on a leave and does not return. Those protocols are now part of a review that is underway, where we will have some preliminary information within 30 days for members of this House. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm responsible for the criminal justice system. The health care and the patients that are in our hospitals comes under the area of the Minister of Health. And what I will do is turn this question over to her. The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the government has two options here: to show leadership when an incident takes place and to show they take it serious, or to sit back and wait for something else to happen and make excuses. Yes, there's a review underway, but that review is going to take some time, and implementing whatever recommendations are will take some time. After the most unfortunate incident where a Nova Scotian lost their life because of what took place at that facility, the government had the option to implement immediate short-term protocols to try to ensure this would not happen again. What we're being told today, and the Premier's saying like what? Well, if you don't know, sir, we can find someone to replace you who will come up with those answers. You asked to be the government. You had all the answers when you said...
Order, order. The honourable member for Richmond has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect that their elected officials are going to do everything possible to ensure the safety and that safety is in place. And we do have professionals that are available to us to work with us to find exactly what short-term protocols can be put in place, knowing that these passes failed once, they've now failed twice. So my question again to the Minister of Health, why were short-term protocols not put in to ensure that this wasn't going to happen again?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a fair question. Mr. Speaker, on a daily basis, there are probably between 10 to 15 people from East Coast Forensic Hospital who have passes into the community. In the vast majority of those cases, people conform to the requirements of those passes. They go on pass and they return without any difficulty, Mr. Speaker. And so until the review is done of the protocols, we will continue to operate because, Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of patients at East Coast go on their passes and return every day without a problem.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, we've recently learned Nova Scotia Power has filed a 6% cumulative rate increase over 2 years. The Premier was quick to table petitions while in opposition, but as soon as he got elected, he quickly broke that promise to families. Disposable income has dropped, Mr. Speaker, 1.8% last year, and people are struggling to pay their bills. This government is taking us backwards into a recession. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Energy: why does he refuse to take into account families' businesses' ability to pay for his expensive bite-the-bullet electricity plan?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. We're all concerned about the cost of electricity, the burden that it places on families, on small businesses, on large industry. And this government has a plan to deal with that, unlike past governments that have relied simply on coal. We've done a number of good initiatives in our renewable electricity plan, and we're going to continue to work our plan. We have a vision to deal with this issue.
The honourable member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP says they have to force a quicker than agreed by wide consensus conversion to green power at great expense. It's ironic that the NDP drives up power rates to solve a problem they say caused high power rates. It is hardly a real solution that is going to help families and businesses pay their power bills. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister. Will the Minister commit to going back to the drawing board on his bite-the-bullet electricity plan and develop a real plan that takes into account affordability?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly past governments have relied on coal, such as the Conservative Party has had a policy of living in the past, of living on, working on coal. Coal's gone up 75% in the last 6 years, and we, on the other hand, have a portfolio of initiatives that will reduce the cost of electricity, renewables. About 1 to 2% is the cost of renewables on our electricity bill. That's reasonable. It's an investment in our future. We've taken a number of initiatives around tidal power, and around wind, around biofuels, around natural gas. Hydroelectricity is a renewable source. I could go on. Efficiency Nova Scotia, LED lights, HST off of electricity. There's many good initiatives that this government has undertaken.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a lot has changed since this government came into power, and unfortunately, not for the better. Rural Nova Scotia has been driven into recession by the NDP. The NDP have taken $1,000 more per family in higher HST rates. They run jobs out of rural Nova Scotia, and they refuse to admit they are to blame, Mr. Speaker. My question, why does he refuse to look at the socioeconomics of our province today and how much people can afford to pay for electricity?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, we did take the HST off of home electricity and other home fuel prices. You know, really, Mr. Speaker, we have to stop living in the past. We have to get off of fossil fuels, and for way too long, past governments have lived on fossil fuels. We can no longer live in the past. We have to stop being a fossil.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Energy. You know, we heard the Premier earlier talk about the removal of the HST from electricity, which, as he well knows, did more to help the top 1% in the province than the bottom 99%. But the fact is there was a little asterisk. There was a tiny little asterisk in that, where they saved, by their own documents, which I will table, they saved Nova Scotians $30 million, but then they've charged Nova Scotians $43 million by adding a new tax. So what the Liberals proposed during the election, Mr. Speaker, what the Liberals would have proposed during the election would have saved ratepayers $10 million, whereas what the NDP proposed with their little asterisks they forgot to tell people about cost ratepayers $10 million. So, Mr. Speaker, would the Minister of Energy explain why the NDP removed the HST saving $28 million and at the same time added a new tax to power bills, so the end result was actually more than the savings from the HST?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, you can play with numbers all you want, but the reality is that we have saved Nova Scotians $100 million on the DSM energy efficiency program, and that's $100 million real money, real savings for low income, for renters, for small businesses, for ice rinks. It's a real benefit to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not playing with numbers. They're the Minister's own numbers. You know, and so if the numbers are wrong, then the Minister's own department's wrong. You know, Mr. Speaker, this minister is out of touch. In 2009, Nova Scotia Power had a profit of $109 million. In 2010, it was $121 million, all earned off the back of ratepayers. Now, when the Tories proposed this new tax for energy efficiency on power bills, the NDP said it was wrong. They said Nova Scotia Power should pay the costs. But then the NDP introduced the legislation to charge ratepayers after being elected. So, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia Power, if they're worried about profits for Nova Scotia Power, if they charged Nova Scotia Power shareholders this fee, Nova Scotia Power would do just fine. They would still have $80 million in profits after paying the $43 million. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister amend the legislation the NDP enacted so that Nova Scotia Power shareholders pay for the efficiency programs from their obscene profits rather than Nova Scotians who are struggling to pay for their bills?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Nova Scotians are telling us these programs are great, they're working, they're saving money. I just want to tell you about one Nova Scotia family here, that a small business operator in the Annapolis Valley that runs 6 Napa auto parts outlets, and his company is located in Windsor, Digby, Middleton, Kentful, New Miners, and Berwick. Peter Dupuy of Middleton is the owner, and he says he replaced all of the ballasts, all the tubes in the whole store. He arranged for initial assessment. I'm going to table this, Mr. Speaker, but he's more than happy with the energy efficiency program that we have here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure he'd be even happier if he wasn't paying to foot that bill and shareholders in Nova Scotia Power were paying it, like we suggested. The best answer this minister can come up with is to say, well, the programs are working. Our argument is who should pay for it, and in the election, the NDP believed shareholders should pay for it, not ratepayers too. So, Mr. Speaker, when the NDP said they were going to take the HST off electricity, they never told Nova Scotians. They planned to tax them in another way. They've taken $43 million from the pockets of businesses and citizens this year. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a real simple question. This is a real simple question, Mr. Speaker. Why didn't the NDP tell Nova Scotians during the election that they planned to introduce a new tax on electricity bills that would cost ratepayers $12 million more than any savings from the HST cut?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this energy efficiency program is it's really an investment for Nova Scotians, for small income earners, for low income people, for renters, for small business, large business. And really, it's the best dollar we can put in towards energy efficiency. It's a dollar we save. We don't have to spend on infrastructure investment. It saves building a new power plant, a new coal plant. So it's a program that's beneficial to all Nova Scotians, and we're going to stick to our plan.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice as it relates to public safety. Yesterday we learned that the police are looking for another patient from the East Coast Forensic Hospital who failed to return from an unescorted pass. An individual who was remanded to the hospital after being found not criminally responsible of an offence. The individual has been at large since Friday at 9:30 p.m. and officials consider this person to be a risk to herself and possibly to others. My question for the Minister: the public was not alerted to this woman's absence for 72 hours as per the hospital's protocol. But does the Minister believe this protocol is sufficient to protect public safety, and will he be revisiting that in light of recent developments?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you for the question, and I'm going to, since it deals with a hospital and not a jail, I will turn that over to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member through you for the question. Mr. Speaker, of course, we're very concerned when a patient from the forensic hospital is away from the hospital without their treatment, and the implications for that patient or for the public. Mr. Speaker, we are the Capital District Health Authority has protocols in place. To the best of my knowledge, they have followed those protocols. We have a review underway with respect to the way decisions are made in terms of assessing risk, and we will have an independent review of those procedures, and a preliminary report will be done within 30 days, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice also has a policy regarding people who are in the care of the province. This policy doesn't specify how long a person who is deemed to be a danger to public safety has to be away from a provincial facility before the department issues a press release. My question, and Mr. Speaker, if it is going to be the Minister of Health that answers it, because the Minister chooses to pass it, I might as well just ask it to the Minister of Health. What criteria does this Minister use to decide when the public should be alerted to a threat to the health and safety of Nova Scotians when it comes to people who are in the care of the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as I have said before, patients from the East Coast Forensic Hospital are not criminals. They have not been convicted of any crime. They're patients, people who have found to have a mental health disorder, and patients who need to be in treatment. The risk associated with releasing patients into the community is a risk that is assessed by trained forensic specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses. This is reviewed by the Criminal Review Board, and decisions are made based on the professional expertise. If a patient is AWOL from the forensic unit, there are protocols. If within 15 minutes of their failing to return in the time frame, the police are notified. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the staff at the East Coast Forensic Hospital, in consultation with the police, make a decision with respect to notifying the public based on their assessment of risk at that time on a case-by-case basis.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Minister of Justice should take more interest in this matter. And while we agree with the Minister of Health, these people are not criminals. Within a 72-hour span, they can certainly commit criminal acts, whether they be considered responsible for them or not. And we saw that, unfortunately, 2 weeks ago when we were last discussing a person who had not returned from the hospital in this chamber. And we learned that there were other patients at large on the same day as the man who is now accused of murder. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Justice: can the Minister inform the House today how many patients have yet to be located who were missing at that time, and of those, how many are considered to be a threat to public safety?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I will turn this over to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
It's a hospital.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The opposition seems to be somewhat confused between what is the difference between a patient in a hospital and a criminal who has been convicted of a crime in a correctional facility. Mr. Speaker, I have no idea how many criminals there are in the correctional facilities of the province, just as the Minister of Justice would have no idea how many patients there are in mental health facilities around the province, Mr. Speaker. So let me say this. I have said earlier in question period here that on any given day from the East Coast Forensic Hospital, there can be as many as maybe 10 to 15 patients given passes of some form, Mr. Speaker, as part of their treatment plan following the assessment of risk that is done by the trained professionals in those facilities, nurses and doctors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the Minister of Energy. A few weeks ago, we learned that the tax added by the NDP to electricity bills is being used to subsidize government departments. And the Minister at the time didn't have any idea what percentage of those funds were being used. So since he's had some time now, could the Minister please tell the House what percentage of the millions taken from the pockets of Nova Scotians as a result of the NDP's tax on power bills is being used to subsidize government departments?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have those particular figures, but I do know that those that pay into the program benefit from the program. So it's like an insurance policy in some ways. If you pay a premium, you should be able to benefit from it when required. So small businesses, large businesses, government departments, householders, renters, they all pay into it. They all benefit.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a bit surprised the Minister's had a few weeks and still doesn't have an answer to that question. It should be fairly straightforward. You know, Mr. Speaker, this is an issue of competitiveness and access to these programs. And in the application to the Utility and Review Board, this tax is proposed to increase by 249% for industrial users. That's just one of the classes. So, Mr. Speaker, this is on top of the rate increases that have already been deferred, the ones announced today, the fuel adjustments, the deferred charges in the pipeline, and for many business owners and residents, it's starting to feel like it's a new week. What will this week's power increase be? So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister please explain why he thinks it's okay for the efficiency tax the NDP added to increase this year and next year, at the same time Nova Scotia Power has announced that they will be increasing bills again this year and next year?
Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, studies have shown that the best way to save energy is in investment in conservation and demand-side management. It's a small investment on each power bill, but year after year it pays off. And it's just not for the year it's done, but for really the rest of the lifetime of that building, whoever owns it. It's savings. It's about a $40 million investment overall, but it's producing over $100 million in savings in energy costs for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you would have got the same $100 million in savings by having shareholders of Nova Scotia Power pay that bill instead of ratepayers. And at the same time would have saved ratepayers in this province $12 million, would have made rates cheaper in this province over what they are today. I mean, it's really quite simple, and that's something the NDP believed during the last election. So for them now to say that they don't believe it is a bit strange since just 3 years ago. And the minister can talk all he wants about if the NDP were in power, we would be off coal. Well, I'm sorry, but just 4 and 5 years ago, the member for Cape Breton Centre was talking about the importance of the Cape Breton coal mines and the use of those coal mines in Nova Scotia Power. He was advocating for those coal mines. We have the Tories. We have the Tories who are sitting here complaining that we should be on coal when in fact that the rates for renewable energy at the moment are still the ones that they implemented under Minister Perron when they were in power. We haven't even hit the targets yet for the Nova Scotia Power. So, Mr. Speaker, the question for the minister, Mr. Speaker, the question for the minister is how much. Mr. Speaker, the question is for this minister is how much is too much? How much of an increase in bills will it take for the NDP to finally say enough is enough and say no to increases in the electricity tax and power bills?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the conservation investments that we're initiating here in the province are saving a tremendous amount of money. In fact, through 2012, through the Efficiency Nova Scotia programs, we'll have saved 460 gigawatts of energy. That's enough to power 40,000 homes in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, if we continue with that program through 2015, we'll save enough energy that we'll not have to build a new coal plant. So it's saving Nova Scotians a whole lot of money, and it's creating a lot of jobs in our province at the same time.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In recent weeks, we've seen Nova Scotian healthcare patients brought to the brink. Intense labour negotiations resulted in 500 cancelled surgeries, and 1,000 more procedures were postponed last month. Simply put, Nova Scotians in need of important medical care had to put their health on hold while the NDP twiddled their thumbs. Later this month, the Nova Scotia Nurses Union, which bargains for 6,000 registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, and nurse practitioners, will be at the bargaining table, and based on the NDP's performance during the negotiation of NSGU Local 42, Nova Scotians are rightly worried. So my question, Mr. Speaker, through you is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. When will the Minister and her colleagues quit twiddling their thumbs, as they did last time, get to work, and provide Nova Scotians with a guarantee that there will be no cancelled procedures or surgeries during the next round of bargaining?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to say that most negotiations in this province are able to be settled through the regular collective bargaining process. Certainly through my department, we're able to provide supports in that process. We have conciliation services, mediation services, and to a large extent, these are all that are necessary to allow both sides to sit down, go through the process, and come to a reasonable agreement. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The last time that this government engaged in healthcare labour negotiations, it took days to even give Nova Scotia taxpayers a hint at what they might be on the hook for. And since the government seems to be getting off on the same foot with the Nurses Union, Nova Scotians be right to expect the same poor treatment this time around. Will the minister commit to correcting the mistakes from the last round of bargaining and make every effort to keep the taxpayers informed? Will they tell Nova Scotians who will foot the bill for the NDP deals?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind members of this House that the Department of Labour and Advanced Education is in charge of the collective bargaining process in terms of ensuring its neutrality and that the proper steps are taken. We do not get involved with actual negotiations. Thank you.
The honourable member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A pattern is starting to emerge. Patients lose, taxpayers lose, and now workers may lose too. Everybody loses when this government makes deals. The NDP still haven't figured out how they're going to pay for their concessions during the NSGU negotiations. Some of the biggest losers may be healthcare workers who may end up losing their jobs to cover the cost of the NDP deal. So my question to the Minister of Health this time, will the Minister assure Nova Scotia nurses that not a single one of them will lose their job as a result of the NDP's bad deal making?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I remind that member and all members of this chamber that this is the government that's already saved the taxpayers of Nova Scotia literally hundreds of millions of dollars with the wage settlements that we have made in the health care and in the public sector in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, nurses are a very, very valuable part of our health care system, and we will work with nurses, treat them with respect, Mr. Speaker, unlike the experience that nurses had when that minister or that member was in government, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia has the highest power rates of all provinces in this great country. This applies to consumers and to businesses, Mr. Speaker, and the effect is a double hit to our economy. Nova Scotians have less money to spend, and businesses have to deal with increasing cost pressures, which is an important input cost for any manufacturer or any business to ultimately make money and provide a product or service to Nova Scotians. Yet this government has been ignoring this problem for far too long and have been inactive in their 3 years as the government in Nova Scotia. So my question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism: when will the minister realize that having the highest power rates in the country is bad for business, bad for our economy, and bad for the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will say this, is that there may be some companies that consider power rates to be a factor, but I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, that what attracts businesses to Nova Scotia are the people of Nova Scotia, is that the work ethic, Mr. Speaker, is combined with a good educated population, Mr. Speaker, the low cost of doing business, Mr. Speaker, and I would say that the time zone that we live in also contributes to Nova Scotia being attractive for future businesses, and it wouldn't work the other way, Mr. Speaker. So we're very proud of those things that we do to attract business to Nova Scotia, and we will continue to do those things that attract good business, good sustainable jobs to the province.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly would disagree. Every single business in this province is sensitive to the cost of power and the rising power rates. Unless you're a candle maker, Mr. Speaker, and you work outside and don't use any power, then I think you're affected. It's an input for business, and it's certainly every single business is affected by power rates. So let's not even suggest that that's not the case, Mr. Speaker. And the minister also talks about the business environment. 0.3% GDP growth, second worst in the entire country. Mr. Speaker, that's a direct measure for the member opposite that doesn't participate in question period. That's a direct measure of our economic growth, Mr. Speaker, and our performance. Power rates are a factor. Taxes are a factor. This is about the business environment. We have an uncompetitive business environment, Mr. Speaker. That's why our economy isn't growing, and that's why we're losing jobs, and workforce participation is down, and we're losing our families, Mr. Speaker. That's what's happening in this province. The pressures that businesses face through the fact that we have the highest power rates not only makes us uncompetitive, but it puts their very businesses at risk. The out-of-control power costs are #1 concern for business. #1 concern. So my question to the minister, when will the minister accept that power is one of the largest concerns for business and take steps necessary to address this costly pressure on businesses in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate is that the cost of power may be an issue for some businesses. But Mr. Speaker, I will say that those things that we are doing in the province of Nova Scotia to attract businesses, such as $25 million, Mr. Speaker, in the PIP initiative, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can also talk about the $10 million investment that we have made in the aerospace industry, Mr. Speaker. Those, Mr. Speaker, I can talk about the $5 million to increase the credit union business loan program, Mr. Speaker. Those are the kinds of things that we do, Mr. Speaker, to attract business, Mr. Speaker. 3 years in a row, Mr. Speaker, we reduced the small business tax credit, Mr. Speaker. Those are the things that attract businesses, along with an educated workforce, along with a strong work ethic, Mr. Speaker. We attract companies to Nova Scotia. It's a plan that's working. We are staying the course.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will reiterate to the Minister and to this House, power rates and the cost of power affect every single business in Nova Scotia. Every single one. And I'm certainly aware the Minister stands here and he talks about the investments. We're all aware that the Minister will write those checks. And the minister will take those pictures and they'll stand in front of businesses and talk about the investments they made. 0.3% growth is the true measure of what we're doing as an economy and as a department, and we're failing Nova Scotians, and we're not creating jobs for today's families. So that's the fact, Mr. Speaker. The highest power rates cannot expect to grow, and last year we posted 0.3% GDP. This is down from 1.9% in 2010 and is 1/4 of what was forecasted by this government and this minister, Mr. Speaker. By failing to accept solutions that our caucus has presented to address skyrocketing power rates, this minister and this government are ensuring that the cost of doing business in Nova Scotia continues to get more expensive and will increase by 6% in the next 2 years. My question to the minister, will the minister take the solutions presented by our caucus and make power more affordable and strengthen our economy, not continue to harm it?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I hear that member go on, it thinks to me that that member is against the investment that we made in Bill Did It in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it reminds me that that member is against the investment that we made in Cape Breton Rail, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that member is also against the investment that we made in Sydney Harbour, the Sydney Harbour dredging, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Order.
that member...
Order, please. I would ask the Honourable Member, the Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that member is also probably against the investment that we made in the Rod Inn in Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all those investments that we make in Nova Scotia, which we will continue to do, Mr. Speaker, because they're the right things to do.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are paying the highest power rates among all the provinces in Canada. At the same time, Nova Scotia Power is guaranteed 9.3% rate of return, guaranteed. Our caucus has been pushing this government to finally act to reduce power rates that Nova Scotians are paying, but the NDP government has done nothing. One proposal we've put forward, Mr. Speaker, has been consistently that we believe Nova Scotia Power should be audited for savings, and that should be done on a regular basis so that before any more power rates are approved, an audit is done. My question for the Minister of Energy is, when will you direct that Nova Scotia Power be audited for internal savings?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly, you know, we're all concerned about the cost of electricity for families, for small businesses, for industry, and the UARB certainly has a responsibility to ensure that the rates are as fair and as reasonable as possible. They have the expertise to bring in whoever they want when there are hearings on public rates, and of course, our party, your party, all Nova Scotians have the opportunity to intervene in those hearings, and if there's something wrong, to tell the board all about it.
The honourable member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we have been intervening in those discussions, but the NDP have been sitting on the sidelines. Nova Scotians are suffering because of this NDP government's lack of action in addressing skyrocketing power rates. Again and again, Nova Scotians are being asked to pay more to Nova Scotia Power. It is affecting businesses and families alike, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, why won't the Minister stand up to Nova Scotia Power and demand that they look internally for savings before allowing them to take any more out of the pockets of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly the UARB has a full responsibility to investigate all proposed costs that come before it, and this government has been doing something about high power rates, and unlike past governments that relied on fossil fuels, we've invested in renewables, in natural gas alternatives, in efficiency programs, in LED lights. We've taken the HST off of electricity. We've helped low-income Nova Scotians. We've helped small businesses. We've helped large businesses, and we're going to continue to work that plan.
The honourable member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Nova Scotia Power is a regulated industry. The government can step in and actually use its powers here. I'm kind of tired of hearing that it's all in the hands of the UARB. Mr. Speaker, the fact is Nova Scotians are angered by the 9.3% guaranteed rate of return that Nova Scotia Power is getting, and at the same time knowing that the consumers are being squeezed for every penny year after year. The rates have gone up a full 40% since 2001, and today we learned that Nova Scotia Power is again applying for further rate increases in the next 2 years. In fact, Mr. Speaker, of all the provinces, as I said, we have the highest power rates already. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister make a commitment to Nova Scotians that there will be no further power rate hikes until a comprehensive audit has taken place at Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, one way that we can use less energy is certainly not by duplicating services that are already available here in our province. The UARB has the full authority to audit every bit of information that comes to them. In fact, they hire expertise that when they don't have all the knowledge, all the information they need to come in and give them a professional opinion. And, of course, there's the consumer advocate and the small business advocate. There's political parties. There's Nova Scotians. They all come and hold the UARB accountable, and in the end, they'll provide the best possible rates for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over 2 months have passed since Talbot House announced they'd be closing their doors. Everybody can groan, but the closure of Talbot House was prompted by a string of poorly judged decisions made by the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, mistakes aside, the people of this province need the services that Talbot House provided. Its closure has come at a great cost to young men in this province suffering from addictions. On April 17th, Mr. Speaker, the Minister told reporters that the province would be issuing a request for proposals and the Talbot House Board of Directors was welcome to apply. So my question to the Minister has already gravely tarnished the reputation of this long-established facility. Does she honestly plan to strip them of their dignity even more by tossing Talbot House into the mix with RFPs?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I have provided this House over and over with clear information, and I have provided documentation and table documentation in this House that supported all that information. And at this point, I've provided plenty of information to the opposition parties. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria de Lakes on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister refuses to acknowledge a role in the closure of Talbot House. But members of this House know that a string of bad decisions made in her department not only set in motion the inevitable closure of the facility, but also continue to damage the reputation of Talbot House. Her department is responsible for $420,000 of funding. And she says that it's up to Talbot House if they decide they want to open up service again. My question, does the minister really stand by that statement? Does she really believe the board of directors of Talbot House are standing in their own way?
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has ended. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in question period last week, the member from Clare asked me some questions on diversity, and I told him I would provide him and table those answers as soon as I got them. I apologize it took a little longer than I had anticipated, but here they are for the edification of the House and that member.
Thank you. The Honourable Government House Leader on government business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the agreement of the House, I asked you to now leave the chair and the House resolve itself and the whole House on bills.
All those in favour? The Honourable Member for Richmond or the...
Yes, Speaker, I would ask that prior to doing that the House Leader for the Government indicate which specific bills that he was planning on dealing with Committee of the Whole before giving consent.
The Honourable Government House Leader on the list of bills.
All bills contained in the report back today with the exception of Bill 17, which is Financial Measures Act, and Bill number 65, the Consumer Protection Act.
The motion is for adjournment. All those in favour say aye. Not adjournment, to go to Committee of the Whole House. All those against say nay. Motion is carried.